They told her to stand in the rain while the real snipers handled the job. Staff Sergeant Tess Ryland held her unit's record for the longest confirmed kill, yet to the 4 male Ranger candidates staying dry under the canopy, she was just a diversity checkbox, someone who didn't belong. None of them realized her radio was still active barely 20 meters away, and a SEAL team commander had heard every word. At 29, Tess had long since stopped expecting much from people. She stood alone at the edge of the instructor platform at Fort Trenton, watching the Carolina rain pound into red clay while the 4 Rangers laughed beneath the shed 30 meters off. They'd been assigned to her for an advanced marksmanship evaluation, part of their final certification before JSOC screening. She was a staff sergeant in the 75th Ranger Regiment, trained by the U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit, and held the battalion's record kill, 1,230 meters, during a direct action mission in Arden Valley. They didn't know that, because they'd already decided who she was. When she arrived, the range was empty except for them. Tess drove from the main compound in a government pickup, rifle case and range bag in tow, 15 minutes early as always. And wherever you're watching from, maybe you know that feeling, being great at something and still not believed. If this story sounds familiar, subscribe. There are more like it here on Captain Joe's Stories. Tess tilted the brim of her patrol cap, waiting for the laughter to die and the work to start. She'd grown up on a cattle ranch in eastern Montana, where winters lasted 8 months and the nearest hospital was 60 miles down a dirt road. Her father, a Marine Scout sniper from the Gulf War, taught her to shoot at 7 because on their land, when things went wrong, no one was coming. By 12, she could read wind at 400 meters and adjust for temperature drops without a chart. She learned patience from the deer blinds and trigger control on coyotes that came too close to the herd. Her father never told her she was good. He just kept giving her harder shots. At 18, Tess enlisted and earned her place in the 75th Ranger Regiment, passing RASP with scores so high the drill sergeants checked the paperwork twice. She went through the Special Operations Target Interdiction course at Fort Trenton, then spent 3 years with a Ranger Rifle Company rotating through Afghanistan and the Arden Valley. By 24, she'd earned her Expert Infantry badge through qualification and lane testing and worn her Ranger tab with quiet pride. During a firefight in Sangra Province, Tess saved 2 teammates by taking out a machine gunner at 1,130 meters with a single M2010 shot, loaded with an MK248 Mod 1 round. Her spotter called wind, logged impacts, and adjusted the dope. That final round hit steel and bought the squad 8 seconds to break contact, enough to get everyone home. Tess never talked about it. She didn't have to. The ones who mattered already knew why she stayed. Belief in standards, discipline, and the idea that competence should always outweigh perception. The 4 Ranger candidates had been told they'd meet a senior instructor. When Tess arrived that morning, the tallest, Specialist Ree Hallbrook, looked her up and down and asked if she was lost. Sergeant Mason Torin joked the real instructor was probably late and maybe she should wait in the truck. Tess stated her name, rank, and that she'd be running their qualification. Mason muttered to Ree about standards slipping. Private Tyler Grange stayed quiet, but looked uneasy. Corporal Nolan Cross just stared at her like she was a glitch in the system. Tess laid out the course of fire, 600 meters, then 800, ending with a cold bore shot at 1,000. Steel silhouettes, 3 to 5 minutes per stage, wind calls required. Ree cut her off, bragging he'd been shooting since childhood and didn't need a lecture. Mason asked if she'd ever fired at those distances, or only read about it in manuals. Nolan suggested calling the range OIC to verify the schedule. Tess didn't flinch. Her tone stayed calm, measured. The range was reserved under her name, she said. Her credentials were on file, and they could either shoot or pack up and go home. Mason finally said they'd shoot, but only if she proved she could do it first. Otherwise, it'd just waste their time. Tess nodded once and told them to set up the targets. Reese muttered something crude under his breath that made Tyler stare at the ground. Tess didn't respond. She'd heard worse and already knew how this was going to play out. She walked back to the pickup, opened her rifle case, and revealed her M2010. The same rifle she'd carried overseas, cleaned so meticulously that the metal still gleamed like new. She assembled it piece by piece, checking every screw, every mount, running her thumb along the barrel to feel for flaws she already knew weren't there. Her hands moved automatically, steady and practiced, while her thoughts drifted to her father, the man who taught her that respect wasn't given. It was earned one shot at a time. She remembered that machine gunner in Sangra, her first round pulling low and left in the wind, the correction she'd made without thinking, and the 8 seconds her squad used to escape. The silence on the radio afterward said everything. She didn't feel anger toward these candidates. Anger was a luxury she'd long since abandoned. What she felt instead was a familiar exhaustion, the weight of proving herself again and again to people who'd already made up their minds. Beneath that fatigue, though, was something colder, sharper: focus. She loaded 5 rounds, chambered 1, and walked back to the line. The rain had softened to a mist, the wind cutting left to right at 12 knots. Tess dropped behind the rifle, adjusted her scope, and slowed her breathing. The 1,000-meter target, a steel silhouette, was barely visible through rain and haze. She ranged it with her laser finder, entered her data, and read her dope. Gusts shifted every 10 seconds, temperature down 3 degrees since morning. It was a tough shot, exactly how she liked it. Mason stood behind her, arms crossed. Reese smirked beside him. Nolan leaned against the shed, rifle slung, while Tyler watched quietly, uneasy but saying nothing. Tess ignored them all. 2 clicks right, 1 up, correcting for wind and a slight drop in elevation. Her breathing settled, finger to trigger. Pressure built slowly, then broke clean. The round left the barrel at 2,250 feet per second, hitting steel just over a second later. The clang cut through the drizzle. She cycled the bolt, reloaded, fired again, then again. 5 shots, 5 hits, all center mass. 90 seconds total. Tess stood, cleared her weapon, and turned to face them. Mason Torin wasn't smirking anymore. Reese Holbrook looked like he'd swallowed a knife. Nolan Cross stared at the distant steel, then back at Tess, expression blank but shaken. Tyler Grange finally found his voice and asked where she'd learned to shoot like that. Montana, she said. Then Fort Trenton, then downrange. She told them if they wanted to pass their qualification, they'd better stop talking and start listening. That's when her radio crackled to life. Calm, clipped, unmistakable. Captain Devlin Caraway, SEAL Team 3 Troop Commander. The same one she'd worked with in Arden Valley 2 years prior. He spoke her name clearly, asking if she was still on the Fort Trenton Range Complex. Tess confirmed. Caraway said he had a problem. 20 miles north, a classified training scenario had gone sideways. Their primary sniper was injured during insertion, and a live-fire interdiction exercise would begin in 90 minutes. He needed someone who could shoot accurately under pressure and not freeze when chaos hit. He'd been monitoring the open range net that morning and heard every word from the candidates. and from her. He remembered her performance in Ardennes Valley and trusted her completely. Tess told him she was on her way. She ended the call, turned to the candidates, and said their qualification was postponed, to be rescheduled through range control. Mason started to protest, but Nolan cut him off, asking if she was serious. Tess said she was, and that if they had an issue, they could explain to the OIC why they'd spent half an hour questioning her instead of shooting. She packed her rifle, loaded her truck, and drove north while the four stood silently in the rain. Later, Tyler looked her up in the system, found her record, deployments, and the citation from Sangra. Ree stayed quiet. Mason just stared at his boots. Nolan finally nodded and said they'd screwed up. Tess reached the sealed training site 40 minutes later. Caraway had cleared her through range control, and security waved her in. Paperwork waited on the table when she arrived. Caraway met her at the ops center, briefing her over the target layout. The scenario was a simulated hostage rescue, live fire interdiction, engaging role players from 400 to 900 meters. SEALs would assault, while Staff Sergeant Tess Ryland provided overwatch from the ridge, taking out designated hostiles to protect the team. It was built to test decision-making under stress. Failure meant a total restart. Tess took position on the ridgeline overlooking the compound, ranged sectors, confirmed wind calls, and synced with Caraway. The exercise kicked off at dusk. For 2 hours, she engaged 11 targets from 510 to 880 meters. Every round precise, every shot on the mark. The SEAL team cleared flawlessly, no compromises. Afterward, Caraway radioed her, calm, certain, telling her she'd done exactly what he expected. Flawless work. The team, he said, respected her professionalism, and she'd always have a place with them. When Tess returned to Fort Trenton the next morning, a message waited from range control. The 4 candidates had requested to reschedule and specifically asked for Staff Sergeant Ryland to run it. Mason Torin filed a formal apology up his chain. Reese Hallbrook did the same. Nolan Cross sent her a personal note, admitting he'd been wrong and asking if she'd teach him. Tess set the session for the next week. All 4 passed. Tyler Grange shot expert. Nolan came close. Mason and Reese qualified strong enough to deploy. Both thanked her afterward. No excuses this time. She didn't tell them it was fine. She just said, "Stay sharp. Keep training." Tess went back to work. Still teaching, still shooting, still proving that skill would always matter more than perception. The candidates moved on to their posts. Some carried the lesson, others didn't. Tess didn't lose sleep either way. She'd done her job, and that was enough.